Once upon a time, there was a struggling toy inventor. Every day, he tried to make beautiful, fun, silly toys that made children laugh, but no one would buy his toys. The toy inventor was on his last dollar until one day he had an idea. He mortgaged his home and used his last bit of life savings for this one final toy. This toy, he decided, would have a name and a story, and he called it a Beanie Baby. Each Beanie Baby toy was given a name and a story, and kids finally wanted one. Not just one, every single one. He made $700 million in 1 year. Now, I don't know if you remember this time or if you were in the US when the Beanie Baby craze was happening, but the Beanie Babies were the hottest toy for the season. And not just one season, for multiple seasons. And people collected, I remember my friends having 100 to 200 Beanie Babies in their room. And this all comes down to the power of stories. These stuffed animals were not all that special, but kids and even some adults loved the stories so much that they became attached to each Beanie Baby. And those stories made the sales skyrocket. Beanie Babies use the power of stories to increase their influence, and now you can too. Why are stories so powerful? Let's see what the research has to say. First, our brains love stories. When scientists put people in fMRI machines, they had them listen to regular conversation, stories, question and answers, and facts. When they heard the story, their brains lit up. Our brains are designed to love and activate when they hear stories. The question is, why? And this brings us to number 2. Our brains feel like they're there with the other person who's telling the story. So basically, what happens in the brain is that during a story, our language processing neural pathways activate. And the parts of our brain that we would have used if we had actually experienced the story light up too. So for example, if someone's telling you a story about getting hit in the head with a ball, the part of your brain that registers physical pain would actually light up, even though you yourself didn't experience being hit in the head with a ball. I guess I should have picked a more positive story. Imagine being tickled by fairies. The part of your brain that would like to be tickled by fairies would get lit up. So you feel like you're experiencing the story along with them. So of course our brains love story. 1, they activate multiple parts of our brain. 2, our brains feel like they're experiencing the story along with other people. And 3, our brains actually get in sync. Researcher Greg Stevens made this incredible finding. I've thought about this research study many times when someone tells me a story, because what he found is that when someone tells us a story, our brain activity actually begins to match their brain activity. So this means that stories not only help us engage our listeners, but they also help them get on the same page as us. Literally, we put them on the same wavelength. You can use this tasty nugget of science on the power of stories to increase your influence. Let me show you how you can use it. I want you to create a story toolbox. Now, this is one of my favorite tools because very few people realize the power of stories. And even when they do, they're like, okay, Vanessa, I get that stories are important, but how on earth do I use that in social or business settings? And a story toolbox is a way that I created to easily use stories in your day-to-day life. A story toolbox is a set of authentic, interesting, and stimulating stories that you have at the ready. So here's how it works. With your story toolbox, you'll be able to naturally weave in stories that you already enjoy telling and then follow them up with challenging questions. So once I started using a story toolbox, it was amazing how many strangers would eavesdrop on my conversations at networking events and then come up and ask, "Oh, can I join your conversation?" I saw in action how sticky stories were, how much our brains crave it. And you'll also notice that when you begin to use your story toolbox, you will have a higher request rate for your business cards because people remember you and so they want to interact with you, whether that's socially or in business. Before I help you build your story toolbox, I want to give you an example of how this works in action. So I'm going to tell you a story from my story toolbox that I use when I'm interacting. Whenever I hear an interesting, unusual, or beautiful name, I always ask that person where their name comes from. This gets them talking about themselves, which we learned is a great idea. And then I share a story from my story toolbox about names. It goes something like this. Wow, what a great name story. You want to know what the weirdest name I ever heard was? At this point, people usually express interest, they lean in with anticipation, and then I say, when I was growing up, there was a set of twins that were at my school, and you will not believe what their parents named them. Can you guess? Now, I always like to play with people and have them guess. The reason is because people come up with fun and interesting names, and it gets people laughing. Once they're out of guesses, then I finally break the news. I tell them these twins were named Male and Famale. That's male with an accent and female with an accent. At this point, people laugh, they groan, they exclaim over parents' cruelty, and I always end the story with, so what's the weirdest name you've ever heard? Now, usually I don't even have to ask that question because people are already sharing their own interesting stories, but I always like to have a challenging question that I end my stories with to bring it back to the group and get them talking again. So there are two important aspects to a story toolbox. First, the stories in my story toolbox are all related to topics that frequently come up in conversations. So I often meet people with interesting, beautiful, or unusual names. I also have a story about wine, which I can bring up if anyone's drinking red or white wine. Second, this story, this name story, like all the stories in your story toolbox, need to have a thought-provoking question at the end so you can get the other person talking. This ending question works great because you can easily get to know more about them and get their dopamine juices flowing. Now, I want to make a special note here to avoid something that's called spontaneous trait inference. So this is a scientific principle that when people talk about someone who has bad qualities, so for example, you say, that woman is lazy, even though you're talking about that woman, people automatically put that trait onto you. It's called spontaneous trait inference. So when you talk badly about someone, people actually associate you with those bad traits. So when you're thinking about stories, I want to make sure that this is not gossip. They're not gossipy or mean. They're interesting, they're thought-provoking, they're inspiring, but be very careful not to gossip or complain or criticize people. First, this isn't a good thing to do in social situations anyway, but second, you're actually putting those qualities onto yourself. So my challenge for you is to create your story toolbox. The goal is to find 3 to 4 stories that you can keep at the ready for social interactions. Eventually, you'll have 10 to 20 as you gather them from books and articles and funny events. I have a note in my phone where I keep all of my stories in case I want to add them or change them or remind myself of what they are. So I have created a series of prompts for you to create your own story toolbox. I have these written down for you in your little ebook, so you can fill them out there, or you can think about these and write them down in your phone on a note. So first, what's the most interesting study, book, or article you've ever read? So think about what are the different things you read. You can even go back to high school. You can even go back to elementary school or your favorite childhood book. Topics like this come up quite a bit in conversation, especially if you can think about anything that you've read about people-to-people interactions or work or networking events. Next, when did a person, situation, or moment turn out differently than you expected? And this is another interesting prompt that can just get you thinking about stories that you've experienced. One of my stories here, I'm happy to share it, it's quite embarrassing, is whenever sports or baseball comes up in conversation, pretty much any kind of sport, because I know next to nothing about sports, and they'll say, did you see the game? Or did you see that amazing shot in the hockey tournament? I don't even know what they're talking about. And I'll say, I'm so sorry, I know nothing about sports, and I will bring up this story. So here it goes. I was sitting with my husband in the car, and someone on the radio mentioned Yogi Berra. And I asked my husband, who's Yogi Berra? And he kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And in my head, I was thinking like a dancing cartoon bear or like the Smoky Mountains bear. But I was like, that's probably not right. Like, I'm pretty sure it was Yogi Bear and not Yogi Berra. So I was like, who is Yogi Berra? And so he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, he's the famous Yankee catcher. And I love history. So I immediately go to the Civil War because the Yankees were known as Northerners. And so I was like, wow, I didn't realize that there were Northerner catchers in the Civil War. Like, I thought there was only slave catchers. And he looked at me like I was even more crazy. And he was like, no, the Yankees. And I was like, yeah, Northerners during the Civil War. And he was like, no, Yankees like the baseball team. And I was like, oh, I get it. It's like a Yankee catcher. So this is how little I know about sports. And then I usually tie it back to them and I say, what's your favorite sport? Or is there a sport that you know absolutely nothing about? Let's move right along. We'll not dwell on the fact that I know so little about sports. The next question, what was your most challenging moment and how did you overcome it? So this, if you want to get deeper with people, if you want to show some vulnerability, this is another great thing that you can bring up. For example, here's another story that I used for my story toolbox. I'm trying to give you as many as possible to sort of get your juices flowing. This is a story that I tell when I'm at conferences or we're talking about expensive networking events, and I'll say, you know, there was one conference that I wanted to go to. When I first started my business, it was this really cool conference and I was dying to go, but it was so expensive I couldn't afford it. And so I did everything I possibly could think of to get into this conference. I volunteered my services as a volunteer. I said I would do anything. I would sweep the floor. I would clean the toilets. And they were like, no, we don't need any volunteers. And I was like, how am I going to get into this conference? And so I decided that every person at a conference needs coffee. That's the one thing everyone needs. So I went to the Starbucks that was in the hotel where the conference was being held. And I told the baristas, I said, you know, I'm going to be here all day. I brought them some Snickerdoodle cookies and I said, I hope it's okay. I'm going to be here all day. Just ignore me. And every time I saw someone get in line from the conference with the conference badge on, I would get in line behind them and I would start talking to them about the conference. And I'd ask them, you know, what are you learning in the conference? And I would say, you know, I tried to go, I just couldn't afford it. So I'm staking out the coffee shop and I'm just talking to everyone in line. And everyone thought this was hilarious. You know, I was very transparent. And I was, I think, 22 at the time. So I said, you know, I could get away with it because of my youth. But I ended up collecting over 72 different cards. And I ended up buying 3 different speakers their coffees by just standing in line all day long. I did way more networking than I ever would have done at the actual conference. And I always end this story by saying something like, what's the best conference you've ever been to? Or was there ever a conference that you were dying to go to but you haven't gotten into yet? And this ties into the last prompt, which is what's the weirdest event you've ever been to? You can always tie in the event that you're going to with other events of that kind. The other quick prompt that I missed was, what's the best story you've ever heard? So worst comes to worst, you can't think of any stories yourself. You are welcome to borrow mine and say, you know, I heard this crazy story the other day from this body language teacher talking about influence, and you can share my stories. You can also share the power of stories, that you were listening to this course on influence and they said that stories were really important and you were trying to think of some really good stories. That also can prompt interesting conversation itself. And I'm all about being transparent, about saying, you know, the reason I use stories is because we love them and it gets juices flowing. And people are amazed to hear that science, and also they're grateful that you're talking to them in a very transparent and open way. I have one more idea for you on how to get some more stories for your toolbox. I have a post called Top 10 Conversation-Worthy Books. These are the books that come up most often for me in conversation, either things I've learned from them or the book itself. I have my 10 favorites on my website, so I'll include a link for that to you below this video. So I thought I would end this section with an inspiring story, surprise, surprise, that hopefully will get you feeling like you can do this just like anyone else. So I was contacted by a photographer a few years ago who was amazingly talented, and she said that she was getting a ton of calls. People would come to her website and say, oh my God, I love your photographs. I would love you to photograph my wedding. She was a wedding photographer and event photographer. And she said that what happened was she would meet with people and she could not book the meetings. She was booking 1 out of every 10 meetings, which was a horrible rate because people already said they liked her photos and they had already cleared the dates. The fact that she was only closing on 1 out of every 10 client meetings is a very low conversion rate. And she said not only that, but the one that did book was always negotiating with her rates. And her tipping point finally one day came when someone met her and said, you know, I never would have guessed that you took these photos. So people were connecting with her photos, but they weren't connecting with her. She couldn't have an influence or a presence on people. So we did a couple of things. First, I taught her how to power pose and how to use body language, which we already learned. Second, I taught her how to add her story to her photos. In other words, instead of having clients come into our office and handing them her photo books, she would sit down with them and go through her favorite photos and the story behind each photo. This did two things. First, it got her talking about something passionate, so it showed her true personality and warmth. Second, it used the power of stories. It hooked her clients' brains. It took her about 2 hours to learn the techniques, very quick, and she spent about 3 to 4 weeks practicing with friends and in low-pressure situations. That summer, as she was doing bookings, she was able to double her rates. I'm working on tripling her rates with her, and now she has a wait list for her summer weddings. All because she was able to increase her presence and her influence. So if she can do it, I know you can do it too.